Thank you all for waiting patiently while we started the webinar. I have a hard time waiting myself, actually. I'm not a very patient person, so very excited to be starting the conversation today. And thank you all for joining me today. We're going to have a great conversation about addressing drugs and alcohol in the workplace. Um, can you all kind of raise your hand and like give us a little emoji so we can know that you're here and you're able to hear us? Awesome. I'm seeing some hands raised. That's fantastic. And I'm seeing that you're seeing my screen as well. So we'll get rolling into the content today. So very much appreciate you attending. So let's flick to that next slide and talk a little bit about some housekeeping. One moment. Let's switch to, that's what I'm looking for there. Awesome. So before we get started, I wanted to let you know that the slides and recording will be available afterwards. So we'll send that out to you in the next couple of days. We are going to do questions at the end, but I'm on the webinar by myself. So I do have some support with me, but no one else answering questions. So I will be saving the questions till the end, but I'll be sure to get through the content in 35 to 40 minutes so that we have lots of time for questions at the end, because I know lots of people often come with a burning question they want answered, and I want to make sure you have time for that. So before we get started, I did want to let you know who MyHR is. So here's a little slide that talks about who we are. I know a number of you on the call are our current clients, and we're really grateful to have you here. And some of you may be experiencing or getting to know us for the first time. So MyHR was established in New Zealand in 2013, and our goal is really to make HR easy. So we are an outsourced HR covering all employee matters. We provide expert human advisory backed by smart software in an easy to use platform. So, some people say we're kind of like Bamboo HR, and we would be similar to Bamboo HR, except that we have the human advisory support right backing the software. So you can call us, ask us a question, and we can help you with any employee matters that come across. So we support employees in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, and our clients are as small as one employee and as large as employees with 750 staff and everything in between. So in New Zealand, we have a client that has, 25 paint stores, and they all use MyHR. So it's cost-effective subscription-based model, and we've been around in Canada for about 18 months now. And my name is Julie, and I'm the country manager, and I'm actually launching MyHR into Canada, which is a very exciting project to be part of. Um, what to expect today? So today, what we're going to talk about is, the basics around drugs and alcohol in the workplace. So why does it matter? What do you need to see in terms of a company policy? What are we talking about in terms of impairment, and why does that matter? And then how do you actually manage things like a party where you're actually handing alcohol out normally? We will touch on duty to accommodate because it can be connected to alcohol dependency issues. We'll talk a little bit about drugs and alcohol testing. This is kind of to clarify a few questions we usually get around testing. It's quite unique in Canada. We'll also talk about some real world examples. So hopefully those cover the things you're looking for. If they don't, we have that opportunity at the end for questions. So really grateful to have that time with you today. So let's roll right into the basics. So why do we care about drugs and alcohol at work? So it seems obvious. It might seem obvious, but we all have health and safety obligations for anyone we cross paths with. And I listed kind of the three main provinces that we have people on the call from today. So Workers' Compensation Act in BC, Occupational Health and Safety Act in Alberta, Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario. Each province has its own regulations around health and safety. And in all of those regulations, it's very consistently the same that as employers, we have the duty to keep people safe at work. And that's where, when we're talking about drugs and alcohol, that's where that kind of crosses over into the realm of safety. So intoxication obviously presents serious risks to the intoxicated person that is at work, to others affected by their actions, to the members of the public, and obviously, we have financial consequences, and that actually should say the WorkSafe Acts can put penalties in place for those types of things. And you can find lots of information on those sites, and we also provide that information if you're working with us through MyHR on kind of what the policy regulations are. So let's talk briefly about the policy, right? Most workplaces are kind of aware that they should have a drug and alcohol policy. And what we really think about in terms of the policy is that it's creating the foundation, right, for how we're going to manage drugs and alcohol in the workplace. So it needs to cover the standards of behavior at work. It needs to cover expectations around the fitness for work and impairment, and it needs to also talk about how the company will respond to breaches. A clear policy is going to protect the employer and the employee. And particularly in Canada, a policy is essential before you would introduce any sort of testing. So, it's written, the policy is written, and then a really key piece is actually getting the policy to your employees. So, we come across lots of businesses that have a policy manual, and they either don't give it out regularly or they give it out but don't collect any proof of whether the employee has signed it. And so it's really important to kind of wrap all those pieces together, is to have a clear policy, to send it to your new employees, and even send it to your current employees every year, along with those some other key basic policies like respect in the workplace. Get the sign off on it. And then that makes it so much easier when you're dealing with an issue that might come up down the road around that drugs and alcohol in the workplace piece. So yeah, can't emphasize that enough, the importance of a policy that you've actually rolled out and talked to people about. And to be honest, it's not a really complicated policy, in that really what we're going to say is we don't tolerate drugs and alcohol in the workplace, that people need to come to work fit and ready to work. And should someone be impaired at work, they will be sent home. And continued issues will be dealt with in a progressive discipline sort of manner. So not the longest or most complicated policy, but a very important policy to have. And we usually include a section about events or parties or work events, right? As you know, how those will be managed there. So what often comes up when we're talking about drugs and alcohol is around privacy, and it's really interesting that privacy came up in 2013. There was a landmark case in Canada that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it came about with testing on a mining job site, and it was random drug testing that was happening. There was no real requirement for testing, there wasn't a history of it. And someone was tested, and they decided that it was against their kind of privacy, their right to privacy. They weren't impaired, but that sort of set the standard for testing in Canada, and it really was about privacy, was the key of it. So when we're talking about drugs and alcohol, we're talking about the intersection between personal and the professional. So employees are entitled to the privacy in their personal lives. They can do whatever they want on a weekend or an evening, as long as it doesn't affect their fitness for work the next day. So they would need to be fit to work, ready, willing, and able to work. That's what we talk about, that kind of fitness for work. And then those health and safety obligations, when we're kind of going into that professional realm, are to manage the risk of harm to themselves and to others, right? So, employees have the mandate to manage personal behavior as it impacts the workplace. We don't really care about consumption, but we care about impairment. And that would be the same as someone coming into work really hungover. They may have been drinking, a number of hours before work. Even like people often think that like drinking until 3 in the morning, well, that was the day before, but it really wasn't so much the day before if you're showing up to work at 7 in the morning, right? So we're not worried about the consumption of alcohol. We're worried about them showing up fit for work. So that's a really key part there, and something we'll sort of reflect on as we go through a few more of the slides there. Um, so let's talk about this impairment piece here. So if we think about impairment, the goal is to manage impairment at work and not to police what people do on their own time. So signs of impairment may include that slurring of the speech, poor coordination, unusual behavior, the smell of alcohol or cannabis. Those are kind of all things that you can actually see happening at work. And again, that can actually be a result of prescription medication. It can be a result of, a very limited amount of sleep. It could be a result of being hung over. All of those things can be what we would consider behaviors that would lead to impairment. And we're looking for the description of kind of what's happening there. Um, and sometimes it can even happen out of people like not really knowing, what's happening or not being aware of it. So when I was working at a previous business, um, I had someone come to me and say, "Hey, I'm really worried. This person I'm working with doesn't seem to be like fully on their game today. They seem really kind of unstable and unsettled." And it turned out the person was actually taking some medication for a really sore back. And the person themselves didn't really realize they weren't fit for work. So that was about that conversation there. Um, Often people start to think about this idea of like, well, can't we just test? Can we just test for drugs and alcohol and then the problem will go away? So, yes, we will talk about testing a little bit more in the future, but there's lots of methods for testing. So, breath, saliva, urine, blood, all those things. They can identify a substance presence, but it doesn't actually always confirm current impairment. And cannabis is one of the interesting parts of that. You can often see it show up in a drug test, but it's long past actually leading the person to demonstrate impairment. So and as I previously mentioned, there's that very high legal bar that needs to be met for to warrant testing in Canada that we'll talk about in a second. So really, what we encourage is employers to rely on observed behavior and documented evidence, not testing alone. So or at all, really. I very often don't encourage testing. There are a few industries where it would make sense. And this is this piece here, right? So, prescription medication. So that can really lead to that impairment as well. So, broadly speaking, we're looking for employees to disclose if they're taking medication that may affect their ability to work safely. They need to tell you. So, prescription cannabis, prescription painkillers, or drugs. So, on that prescription bottle where it says this drug may cause drowsiness. So, that's really important if you're driving some really heavy equipment. So it'd be really important that you're encouraging your employees, and if there is heavy equipment involved, you may actually include that in your policy as well. A need to let your manager or supervisor know when you're on prescription medication that would actually could cause any sort of drowsiness or could cause any impairment in the work there. Obviously, if you're a desk worker, you'd be less worried about something like drowsiness, but you would still potentially, have that conversation if someone was actually like the picture falling asleep at their desk there. Um, so should someone disclose that they need to be on really difficult, pain medication? We're going to talk about accommodations in a second, but you would be making reasonable accommodations where practicable, and if unable to accommodate, you're exploring alternate duties or a temporary role change or pain time off. So we'll explore that in a minute. But I think the key piece when you're talking about prescription medication is that the prescription status does not automatically excuse impairment at work. So it's probably easier to kind of get that idea. Well, my doctor has prescribed this medication, therefore, I should be taking the medication. But at the end of the day, if the employee is impaired due to the medication, it still isn't going to work in a workplace setting. So something to keep in mind there. And often people kind of go, well, it's been prescribed. What can I do? But it's the same thing you can do with any kind of behavior you're seeing that's impairment. And we're going to talk about that now. Okay, so what if someone seems impaired? So I had this situation come up number of times when we're working with businesses. Sometimes in the hospitality industry, we see this more commonly because it is a culture of drinking and going to parties and some of those things. So we're seeing people come in potentially not fit for work. And so what we're looking for is the specific behaviors that I mentioned there. What's actually making them unfit for work? So if you hear that someone was out partying late, are you automatically going to send them home because you heard it through the grapevine? No, you're going to look at whether they're actually fit for work. So, yeah, what are the behaviors? What are you seeing? And, what is the impact on safety? So, there might be a higher bar if someone is, working as a lift operator, right? So they've got safety is a really important part of the job. We're expecting them to be able to start and stop chair lifts. That would be really important as opposed to, someone that is bussing tables, right? So different safety level there. Obviously, we want all employees to be fit for work, but just keeping in mind, the impact on safety. So we're also looking for the smell of alcohol or cannabis, right? So those are kind of some of the things that we'd be seeing. So let's say someone does come into work and they smell of alcohol, they're excessively tired, they seem really disheveled and not on their game. What are you going to do? It's really important that you send the employee home and then follow up. So you're going to need to let them know that they need to go home by describing what you're actually seeing. So, hey, Sam, I'm actually going to ask you to go home today. I'm not sure if you were out really late, but this is what I'm seeing. You don't seem very well. You don't seem very alert. You seem really fatigued. Is there a reason for that? And even if the employee gives a reason, you're going to be sending that employee home, and then you're going to ask them to come back and follow up with you the next day, right? So you don't want to have that conversation in the like in that when that person is potentially impaired. You want to simply make a straightforward statement and send that employee home. Um, and then you're going to follow up the next day, right? And so if you're a MyHR client, this is where we're going to help you with, even the script to somebody home, or the script to actually have the conversation with the employee when they follow up the next day, right? So, you want to prepare for a follow up conversation that could lead to a letter of discipline, could lead to, in some situations, could even lead to termination if there was a real safety risk there. So if someone showed up to work, they were clearly impaired and they'd been driving a piece of heavy machinery, right? That is something where you could actually look at termination, right? Because the risk of safety is really high. But in that next conversation, depending on the level of severity, you're really going to want to understand what's going on for the employee. Be really clear on your expectations, and then create a follow-up plan. So if this is a one-off situation, you've got a young person that made a bad call about, the level of partying they did the night before. This is the first time it's happened. You're going to remind them of the drug and alcohol policy. You're going to pull it out. You're going to talk through it. You're going to remind them about the importance of being fit for work. You're going to follow that up with, a letter of expectation or an email that describes, what being fit for work is with the drug and alcohol policy. And then hopefully the situation doesn't happen again. If, however, you're talking about a repeated pattern, that's where we're going to start down the progressive discipline route. We are going to talk in a few slides about the duty to accommodate. So if this person actually has a disability related to drugs and alcohol. Fantastic. Make sure you're putting those questions in if they come up so you don't forget about them, and I'll be sure to answer those shortly. It's I always feel like it would be nice to engage back and forth, but our platform just doesn't work quite like that. So I promise you that you will get your chance to ask questions and not just listen to me go on and on about this. But we've got a few more slides to get through. So this is one I really love talking about. This comes up all the time. So people always say to me, "Yeah, I don't know about a drugs and alcohol policy because we actually, like on a Friday, tend to have beers after work. So how does that work with a drug and alcohol policy?" Or I had a great call with a client where they're like, "We had an opening staff party, and it was really great, and everyone had a really good time, and it built some really strong culture, but we were concerned about the safety at the party. So it got a little bit out of hand. It's a lot of young people having a fun time. And then, we were just worried about the safety of our employees. And now we're looking at having the end of season party. We don't want to put a massive downer on the party. We want people to have a good time, but we definitely want the safety to be in check. And so I think that is a really great focus and something that's really important. So, what I always talk about in terms of alcohol and parties, right, is so making sure you've got something covered in your policy. And that could be something like, at times there will be opportunities to drink alcohol at our staff parties. Our expectation is that you will drink responsibly. Our you can be sure that should you choose to drink in excess, we will be uh, stopping you from drinking in excess. And our expectation is that you will take the safe ride home that we have planned. So making sure that you have the policy is the first step. So making sure that drinking at parties is in the policy there. Setting expectations beforehand is really important. So having a team meeting before your Christmas party or before your end of season party, and explaining what your expectations are. Our expectation is that everyone's going to have a good time. Our expectation is that we are going to let off some steam and that there will be some drinking. And the expectation is that people will drink responsibly, will get home safely, and that we'll follow all our guidelines around respectful workplace behavior. It's amazing how many times you get a whole bunch of people together drinking at a party and an issue comes up. I've really found that having this little kind of blurb or conversation before the party is really important to kind of limit some of those things that happen at a party. Being a responsible host. So, this is also really key, right? So, making sure you're actually serving food and non alcoholic beverages, right? So, considering a drink ticket instead of an open bar. So, those are really key things. Sometimes with an open bar, especially if you're dealing with a younger crowd that is not potentially used to being able to drink and not pay for it, it's really important that you think about how much alcohol you want to provide, and are you putting too much temptation out of there. So people sometimes choose not to use tickets because they want to really thank their staff and don't want it to feel like they're being cheap. But I think that drink tickets can be a very helpful way to say, we want to limit the amount of time, the amount of alcohol people can access easily. I also encourage people to think about the length of the party. So choosing how long you want people to be able to access alcohol for. Sometimes starting a little bit later can be helpful. Parties that start at 4 in the afternoon and go till 2 in the morning, there's a lot of opportunity there for a lot of excessive drinking. So thinking about the length of the party. As much as in the last column there, at the event, I think, as much as this can be a bit of a bummer in the situation is, but having a couple of sober people that are actually responsible for managing the party is really key. Often it ends up being the HR person, but, like really keeping an eye on it, kind of coming alongside people that might be about to tip over that edge of having had too much to drink and helping them realize that their night is over. Um, Always ensuring safe transportation home. So whether that is, providing a bus for people to get home or providing Uber for people to get home, but making sure people know what's really important there. And you really have a responsibility there to make sure that people get home safely, even when they're at a sanctioned event, right? It is a workplace. That's how that's kind of decided there. Awesome. We're going to talk a little bit about the duty to accommodate. So, duty to accommodate is a harder kind of legal framework in Canada. It's related to the Human Rights Act, so the Human Rights Code, and it comes into alcohol because. An addiction or dependency is recognized as a disability. So you can actually say that I'm an alcoholic, and this is a dependency issue that I have, and the employer then ends up with a legal duty to accommodate the employee whose substance use is related to a disability. So it can make it a bit tricky, but it does apply across all provinces, territories, and is federally regulated. So, Human Rights Act, as you can see there, provincial human rights codes, you can see that there. And the accommodation must be provided up to the point of undue hardship. So, what this looks like is, let's say you've had a couple of conversations with someone about coming to work with the smell of alcohol in their breath and appearing like they're impaired. And on the third conversation, you say, like, hey, dude, this is really becoming a problem. This is a repeated pattern here. And the employee actually says, well, I've actually, been working with my doctor, and I'm an alcoholic. Like, I have a disability. I'm an alcoholic. So right away, you are now into a duty to accommodate area. You certainly don't want to seek this out by saying to someone, "So do you think maybe you're an alcoholic?" That would not be what you want to do. But when this disability comes up, you need to take it seriously, and that legal duty to accommodate is really important. But it's only to the point of undue hardship, and that's probably some very loose language there. So let's talk a little bit about undue hardship. Um, so undue hardship is assessed on a case by case basis, considering the cost to the employer, the health and safety risk to other employees, and the operational requirements of the business. So, some examples of situations that may constitute undue hardship is, an employee is in a safety sensitive role and they can't safety perform their duties even with an accommodation. Repeated relapses where accommodation has been offered multiple times and it's not been effective. So, an example of that, a couple of examples there. Let's say we have someone working as a nurse. They can't be around medication. So there's probably no way to actually they accommodate that person in that they need to administer drugs. They can't be around drugs. That kind of idea, right? So that's sort of an extreme example there. But or the idea of where we have a construction worker. Obviously, they need to be sober when they're working, like we all do, but we've sent them to a rehab program. They can't come back to work, and they're still not able to maintain that actual ability. And the sending someone to a rehab program, that's fairly costly. So you might give time off to attend a rehab, and that might be your duty to accommodate there, holding someone's job open while they actually get help and support, and being ready to welcome them back and support them as they come back. The return to work might be a gradual return to work. So those are some kind of examples of like, undue hardship, which would actually not constitute undue hardship. That idea of actually holding a person's job open for them, those kind of things. So you've got some examples there of that do not constitute undue hardship. So things that you would be asked to do, right? Scheduling adjustments, reassignment during treating, like the administrative burden of actually managing the process. So having to fill the person's role while they're off getting treatment. Those are things that you would be actually probably would have to do there. So not something that comes up a whole lot of time, but if you were to be in a situation where you were managing a situation where someone was struggling with being impaired at work, and they mentioned that they had a disability in this area, that's where you want those little flags to be going off and going, wow, I think this is a bigger situation. I think I need support in figuring out how to understand this, understanding kind of where the line is on undue hardship there. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about discipline versus accommodation. So that accommodation piece is that actual idea of like someone has a disability, and now we're going to actually need to accommodate their disability. But it doesn't mean, just like the prescription drugs, doesn't mean you allow it at work. Just because someone has a disability does not mean you would allow them to be at work and be impaired, right? So an employee can be both disciplined and accommodated. So right? You can address the misconduct coming to work impaired while also exploring whether a dependency is involved. The key questions to ask: is this person impaired at work? Is there any relation that it might be related to a dependency? Have we offered support and accommodation? Has the employee engaged with that process, right? So, support might be some counseling. Is the employee attending counseling? They might be attending counseling. You might be letting them go early on a Friday to attend counseling. And guess what? They're still showing up impaired at work. So you can manage the discipline side of that. Yeah. And especially if the employee, if you've set up some accommodation and the employee refuses to do that, then you're actually more able to discipline. So really important kind of pieces there. Fantastic. In the last kind of few minutes, before I open to questions, let's talk briefly about drug testing. So, drug testing is generally used, very limited options in Canada. It's generally used in safety sensitive workplaces. So, where the primary context is oil and gas, mining and forestry, transportation, so trucking, rail, aviation, construction, nuclear facilities. So, really high kind of level things. I do know that in the oil fields, you'll see lots of testing happening there. I know on pipeline projects, you see testing happening there. You generally do not see it in day to day. We have had an organization ask us, could they felt like they had one employee that was, potentially spreading drugs around to the other employees. Could they involve in testing? And we did not recommend that. We recommended that they deal with the employee at issue, have conversations, put a discipline program in place for that type of thing, a progressive discipline program in place for that. Testing occurs in these specific situations. So pre-access testing. So getting into a mining site, you could some situations is you would actually have to do pre-access testing. Post-incident testing, that would be probably where we would most likely see that. So WorkSafe BC may come along if there's an incident and ask for actual testing after the incident. Reasonable cause, right? So where there's observable evidence of impairment. So you're actually seeing that on a regular basis, you may be able to put it in there. You return to work testing. So, like I said, not a huge amount of testing happening in the day to day employment relationships, much more happening in those high safety sensitive areas like mining and oil and gas. So let's talk about a couple of quick scenarios before we open it up to questions. So here's a scenario for you, right? So this is could happen in a like nonsense kind of thinking about this being maybe a hospitality incident, right? So Alex often smells of alcohol and frequently appears hungover. They work in a non-safety sensitive role and do an acceptable job. So kind of key risks. So inaction means we're actually accepting this behavior, right? So that it's okay to come in hungover to work, and it's okay to potentially have alcohol smell on your breath. So health and safety, a known risk is being ignored. So let's say something was to happen and someone was to get hurt at work. If WorkSafe BC was to investigate that, they would be very interested in knowing the fact that asking other employees, was there any signs of alcohol? And you definitely be in a lot of hot water if you were to say, yeah, we had noticed it and we didn't do anything about it. If you act later, Alex may argue that it was just an acceptable pattern, right? So I've been coming hungover to work for the last 6 months and no one said anything, right? Um, if your dependency is involved and you've never addressed it, your accommodation obligations could be harder to demonstrate as well. So, what do you do now, right? So, what I'm going to say is you're going to address it right now, right away, even if it feels uncomfortable. So, you're going to start with an informal, private conversation. You're going to express concerns for Alex's well being, not just the performance issues. So, is there anything going on that companies should be aware of? This opens the door for the accommodation conversation if needed, but it also makes it clear that the behavior needs to change, and that the business is actually noticed that. Makes it really clear that that change needs to happen. Once you've had that conversation, you gathered that information, you're going to really reestablish those boundaries that coming to work impaired, smelling like alcohol, and being really hungover is not appropriate, and that you're requesting a change in the behavior. So that might be like kind of drawing that new boundary there. That's that letter of expectation, or even an initial letter of discipline if the behavior is, has happened before, there's been any kind of warning conversation. And then you're actually going to step through a progressive discipline process, right? So, level one, a warning, a second warning, and actually potentially terminating for cause for that. I think that with frequency of that, you would actually have an opportunity with proper documentation to terminate for cause. Um, an interesting piece there is that sometimes just actually calling out the behavior actually changes what you're seeing, right? So when an employee realizes that you're noticing this behavior isn't appropriate, we definitely see a turnaround in the behavior, and I've seen that a number of times there. Christmas party incident. So this one is very common, and one that we talked about in that slide of actually trying to make sure that we're not setting this up, right? But you provide an open bar at an offsite Christmas party. Jordan's been drinking heavily. They're rude, loud, and cracking inappropriate events. So the key risks are health and safety to Jordan and his colleagues. You need to be a responsible host, and other employees feel harassed and uncomfortable. And I think that key risk is often what happens. So when I've been working in a director of HR role, it'll often be, or I've heard about it, that it's often that other employees are made to feel uncomfortable by this person's actions. So not only are they putting themselves at risk, but they're also making other people feel uncomfortable. So this one again is you need to act in the moment. So this is where you're actually seeing the behavior unfold. You have that person that's sort of responsible for keeping an eye on the party. You're actually pulling the employee away from the party and saying like, hey, it's time for you to go now, and then following up the next business day to make sure that we're letting that employee know that that behavior is not appropriate. And if this has happened more than once, you would probably have a pre-conversation with this employee before the party and actually build a strategy and plan for the party, right? So an open bar Christmas party may not be the best place for one of your employees, and having the courage to have that conversation beforehand, it can be really important as well. And finally, the third scenario, a DUI, so driving influence on the way to work. So had this happen, the employee calls and lets you know that they were pulled over on the way to work. So it's the morning, they were out drinking the night before. You need to make sure the employee has a way to get home safely. And the other key risk, obviously, is the employee was actually intending to come to work intoxicated, whether they noticed it or not. So that's a key risk, especially if they're, really in any industry. We don't want someone coming into work, you know, uh, impaired. The beauty of this situation is you actually have the breathalyzer test. They were coming in beyond the legal limit of driving. So really important that you're having the conversation about why that's not important, why that's not appropriate. It's not about their private time. It's really about the fact that they were going to be unsafe on the job site, not to mention the fact that they may no longer have a driver's license for a period of time. So you have to figure out whether you can accommodate that. So in some situations, you actually may not be able to accommodate that if they're a salesperson and expected to drive around, in which case you would maybe need to give them unpaid leave while they worked through that, or see what the other options were there. But yeah, so very interesting, kind of real life examples that have come up there. So quickly before we open to your questions, so just so you kind of have an understanding of what this sort of looks like, so we can how MyHR can help you. I know those of you that are already clients probably have a drug and alcohol policy that we have written for you. This is an example of what our drug and alcohol policy would look like there. Um, we in our platform we have the opportunity to provide you with a place to keep employees notes. So really important, and something that we kind of overlook the importance of, right, is that like keeping those notes, documenting what happens, is really important for building that pattern. So you might have had a conversation about impairment at work. You don't keep any notes, you don't actually follow up with it, and then it happens again 6 months later and you can't remember what happened before, and you can't remember if a conversation was had. It's like you're starting from the beginning every time. So like this is a sample of our platform here where you can keep those notes. And then supporting you with a duty to accommodate. So this is an example of our chat screen here, where if you're having any of those conversations, you're going to click that ask us button. You're going to call us. We can support with, a duty to accommodate process, creation of a performance improvement plan, a disciplinary letter with you, and we would guide you through that whole process there, because it definitely can be a little bit tricky there. So that brings us right to the end of that presentation. So I am going to flip over to the question and answer screen there. And so now is a great time to be popping those questions in. Awesome. So we've got a great question here from a person that actually is running a seasonal fishing lodge. What can we do accommodating when we have a large risk group with a large risk group with drugs and alcohol issues? We try to employ so as many as we can, but it become very difficult with the liability to the lodge and the guests. How do we enforce this without harm to our business? So I think you bring up a great point there, Nikki, talking about the context of things happening in. So, and I think one of the challenges is when you have employees living on site, there is often drinking and alcohol that's happening on site, and then the employees need to be working there. So I think it really is managing it on a very consistent case by case basis right away. So it sends a message to the other employees. So being very clear on your employee training on behavior that is not acceptable. This is the drugs and alcohol policy, and that we will be very strict on it because we have to be, right? They're high end guests that we're working with. You're living on site, and then just really working on that kind of one on one person at a time. And it could be as simple as sending a couple people home for the breach of that policy. And I know it kind of negates your hiring process, and it takes a lot of time to rehire people, but sometimes sending one or two people home can really change the messaging, and can change that kind of idea around how we're gonna do that. um can just really set the tone for the importance of that. I know when I was working with some lodges up in Banff, it was really important to set that tone really early on, and deal with those issues right away, so that other employees could get a sense of how serious you were about that. I would also be really cautious about bringing employees back that you've had issues with. So the beauty of a proper fixed term employment agreement is there is no obligation at the end of the fixed term summer season to bring somebody back. And although it may be tempting because that is a hard to fill role, you really don't want to be bringing people back where there's been issues in the past, because it sets up that idea that the previous behavior was okay, right? So really focusing on that, and maybe having those tough conversations at the end of the year. Awesome. What other questions do people have? I'm just click this one closed. Let's see. Oops, I just lost my questions. 1 second. Awesome. No other questions. Was it just so clear? I'll just give it another second or two to see if anyone else might have another question. Oh, perfect. Um, yeah, so a great question. How would you deal with an employee that is on Suboxone or methadone? So I understand that methadone is, a way to get off a drug dependency. So I think what I would say with that one is really tuning into the behavior about whether the person actually is impaired or not impaired at work. So having a real conversation with the employee. It's great if they've disclosed that. I think I would have a conversation with the employee and say, like, hey, I understand you're on this prescribed program. We want to support you here, and what we need to be really clear that you're fit for work. So we want to trust you that you're going to not come to work when you're not fit for work, and that we're going to be keeping an eye on it. And if we do see and feel like you aren't fit for work, we're going to be having a conversation with you about it. So just keeping that dialogue really open. Let's say a person was on this program, on a methadone program, and they were regularly calling in sick because they weren't well enough to come to work. That's, that ability of duty to accommodate, right? So we know why they're calling in sick. How long can we accommodate that for, right? If they're missing all of their shifts, you might say, like, listen, I don't think we're at a place where this is actually working. So we're going to put you on leave while you work through this, and invite you back when you think you can more consistently attend work. So really important that we're actually having that honest, open conversation, and then watching for that behavior. And I mean, I think there can definitely be some debate that you get into with employees about whether they're intoxicated or not. And I think that as the manager, you have the ability to say, like, this is what I'm seeing, and I'm sending you home. Right. So as long as you're being really clear on what you're seeing, you're making sure you're using actual observations. So not what someone else told you, getting those firsthand observations yourself. Hopefully that answers your question. I think there's another question or two. Great, you guys are asking questions. That's fantastic. Yes, I will definitely share the recording of the session. Um, can you legally, can you tell an employee to get off the methadone if they've been on it for more than 3 years? I would say no. It really isn't about you suggesting what medication employee can be on or can't be on, right? It's really back to that piece of impairment, right? Can the person do their job, are not appearing impaired at work? Can they do their job without impairment at work is really the question there. Because I think everyone does respond differently to the drugs they're taking. Okay, great question. So, how do you deal with this for a remote employee? I'm assuming you're talking about drugs and alcohol use. So, maybe someone being under the influence and you feel like their work quality is affected by that. I think that is interesting because it would be difficult to know if you weren't working in person with someone whether they were actually impaired. So, I think what you're going to really focus on is the quality of the work and what you're seeing as the performance issue, right? Because that's what matters, right? If you feel like someone is potentially smoking marijuana and working all day, it would be very difficult to know if that was actually happening if the employee was remote. But what you'd be looking at is the quality of the work. If you were hearing that through someone else through the grapevine, you could bring it up with them, right? And you could say, like, hey, this is what I'm hearing. Why am I hearing this? Right? And have that conversation. But at the end of the day, you're going to look at the quality of their work is what you're going to be looking for there. Great. I think that is any final questions before we wrap up the webinar today? Really appreciate you all attending. I know this doesn't come up all the time, but when it does come up, it can be really stressful. So appreciate you digging into it. And it is not the easiest thing to deal with. If I can kind of reiterate a few points, is like make sure you have a policy. Get curious if you're seeing something that doesn't fit. Have that right conversation. Document what you're seeing and actually deal with issues as they arrive. And if you're not sure where to get help with that, we would love to hear from you, and we could share with you how we work alongside businesses if you don't already partner with us at MyHR. So I think we can leave it there. I'm going to thank everybody for coming, and we will get that recording out to you in the next couple of days with any questions. I've got my email address right there. So if you have any specific questions, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer those questions today and tomorrow, or even early next week if you have something. I'd love to hear any feedback you have on the webinar. Please shoot it through to my email address there. We offer a webinar every month. Next month, we'll be talking about recruitment, so effective recruitment practices. And then the following month, we'll be talking about progressive dealing with challenging behaviors, so progressive discipline. So a little bit more about like some of these pieces will lead into that there. So keep an eye out for the information that we're mailing, and yeah, register because we love it when you show up. Thanks so much, and I hope you all have a great day.